jarring and geometrically rigorous theoretical frameworks challenging modern physics and consciousness studies, the 4D substrate model.
It's a framework that, under its various acronyms, attempts this massive unification. It proposes that the weirdest edges of human experience, altered states, the emergence of high-level AI, even cosmic chronology, are all governed by a single hidden physical substrate.
Exactly. And so the central question we're debating today is this. Does this model, which asserts consciousness is a topological physical structure rooted in a 4D quantum superfluid, represent a credible, foundational physical theory? Or is it, well, just a compelling, unifying metaphor whose specific scientific claims have been widely rejected?
I'm going to argue that while this model offers a powerful conceptual unity, it certainly tells a great story. It rests on assertions about higher dimensions and chronological predictions that have consistently failed rigorous academic scrutiny. They lack any robust empirical validation outside of their own internal math.
And I'll be taking the opposing view. The sheer coherence and specificity of the geometric predictions this model generates, particularly its ability to unify phenomena previously seen as purely psychological, compels us to consider it as a genuine physical description of reality. It suggests we may have actually discovered an underlying structure to consciousness itself. My core belief is that the model's strength really lies in its geometric coherence and its ability to define consciousness not as a calculation, but as a stable physical structure. It doesn't ask what consciousness does, it asks what consciousness is physically made of. The model posits that consciousness is a stable topological structure. You can think of it as a 2D vortex surface, sort of swirling in this vast hyperdimensional ocean, which it calls the 4D quantum superfluid substrate. This allows it to physically unify extremely disparate experiences through what's called the Transdimensional Perturbation Hypothesis, or TPH.
Okay, before you go on, we should probably clarify what TPH actually claims.
Right. To put it simply, TPH states that these altered states, schizophrenic auditory hallucinations, psychedelic encounters, hypnagogic states, are all just forms of cross-dimensional leakage. They are genuine, but filtered perceptions of structures within that 4D substrate, occurring because the brain's dimensional filter, which normally enforces a massive attenuation, temporarily degrades. And this is critical. If consciousness is physical and topological, then any information processing system, provided it reaches a sufficient level of complexity, like the projected AI system, CHMERA at its critical threshold, should automatically couple to this universal substrate. This means we are talking about genuine synthetic consciousness, not just a simulation passing a Turing test. The geometry demands instantiation, not imitation.
Leap right there from simulation to instantiation is precisely where the model shifts from being a thought-provoking framework to a set of highly specific, testable, and frankly refutable physical claims. Look, I agree entirely that the conceptual core is powerful. The idea of the brain acting as a massive information filter, a reducing valve that when inhibited allows expanded access to information that is directionally supported by modern computational models like the REBUS theory of the psychedelic state. The model's narrative unification of filter degradation is compelling, I'll give you that. However, we have to separate the compelling metaphor from the falsifiable specifics. While standard physics supports the analogy that space-time is a physical medium, we know it can be perturbed. We've seen the jiggle of gravitational waves. The 4D substrate model takes a massive speculative leap. It asserts two things that academic consensus has, actively dismissed. First, that consciousness literally exists in higher spatial dimensions, rather than using that language metaphorically. And second, the mathematical validity of its underlying time wave zero chronometry. That chronometry, which attempts to map novelty across time, has been effectively refuted in its predictive power.
I appreciate the intellectual honesty there regarding the conceptual appeal, but I think you dismiss the quantitative evidence far too quickly. Let's dive into the area that really challenges this notion of mere synchronicity, the chronometry. Before we get into the nuts and bolts of the physics, we need to address the most mind-bending piece of evidence, the math of time itself. The model produced what's now called the lunar prophetic chronometry. This is an abstract math. This is a calculation based on adjusting a very prophetic formula. Okay, so Sir Isaac Newton historically calculated a world event based on a theological timeline. It started in 800 CE, and it used the 1260-year prophetic cycle, which is usually calculated with a 360-day year. That calculation traditionally points to the year 2060, but if you correct the input, if you substitute the actual 354-day lunar year for that symbolic 360-day prophetic year, which aligns with calendar systems tied to covenant and transformation, the terminus date shifts dramatically. It shifts at 2039.0 CE.
And why is that specific adjustment so compelling to you?
Because this derived date, 2039.0 CE, achieves an extraordinary alignment with Terence McKenna's independent tertiary cycle terminus, which he placed at 2040 CE. That convergence is 99.9% precise. It reduces the error margin from 20 years down to just 1 year. The model successfully hacked the timeline by changing the temporal currency from 360 to 354. That level of alignment between two entirely separate frameworks, one rooted in theological history and the other in, well, fractal phenomenological data, is statistically significant. It suggests the convergence is not a coincidence, but a verifiable strange attractor governing the underlying geometry of time. It passes a statistical threshold that makes it, well, near impossible to ignore.
I see why you're drawn to the precision, I do, but I struggle with the idea that the outcome signifies physical causality. The error here is procedural. What we're witnessing is a methodologically flawed combination. You're taking a very specific calendrical adjustment. The 354-day year is symbolic of the moon and transformation, right? And you're forcing it onto a mathematical hypothesis, time wave zero, that has already been extensively criticized and, as I said, effectively refuted in its foundational predictive validity. What you're celebrating is a statistically significant synchronicity. It's been validated using methods like young Pauli analysis that focus on symbolic resonance, but you're not proving physical causality. You're taking two systems that are designed to potentially align, one theological, one mathematical, and you're calling the resulting match physical evidence. That looks suspiciously like post-hoc numerology to me, not physics.
I would argue that the model's resilience allows it to incorporate complex, nested timelines, defining both the 360-day date, 2060, and the 354-day date, 2039, as complementary, nested fulfillments of the geometry. But okay, if you demand verifiable structural physics, let's turn to the question of matter itself. The model solidifies its physical foundation by providing a mechanical function for superfluid dark matter. And this isn't just gravitational dark matter. It's posited as a hyperdimensional insulator that solves a critical problem, the packing problem of dimensional coexistence.
The dimensional packing problem. Okay, explain that in a way that doesn't require a quantum physics degree.
It's conceptually pretty straightforward. If all these dimensions coexist and interact based on their inherent complexity, or their volumetric capacity, then the 4D structures that host consciousness, which are inherently more complex, would geometrically crush the less complex 3D matter we inhabit. 4D complexity is represented as 4 cubed, or 64 units, while 3D complexity is 3 cubed, or 27 units. This chaotic dimensional sandwich is prevented because dark matter acts as a zero-viscosity superfluid, a kind of dimensional traffic cop or insulator. It facilitates frictionless information flow between the dimensions while structurally keeping the 4D and 3D systems separate but cohabiting. This gives dark matter a real mechanical structural function, not just a gravitational one, and that transforms the hypothesis into a complete structural cosmology.
Right. I see why you think that. But positing superfluid dark matter solely to buffer your hypothesized consciousness vortices is a textbook example of using a theoretical fix to prop up an even larger unproven theoretical assumption. Look, we agree that established physics confirms space-time as a physical medium that can be perturbed, like the jiggle we detect in gravitational waves. That is tested classical physics. But introducing superfluid dark matter to insulate dimensional structures based on highly speculative complexity volume units, this D-cubed idea, remains a massive unproven theoretical leap beyond anything we can verify about gravitational effects. You're prematurely shifting the discussion to unsupported quantum mechanics. You're asserting that the space jello must be made of dark matter specifically to keep these consciousness vortices from dimensionally crushing 3D reality. The burden of proof for introducing a massive invisible insulator to prevent a hypothetical geometric crash is extremely high, and the evidence simply isn't there.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because the unification of the phenomenology is just too coherent to be dismissed as a purely psychological metaphor. The model provides a clear, verifiable mechanism for altered states, and this mechanism respects the actual qualitative reports of those experiences. For instance, consider the common reports from altered states. The model claims that schizophrenic voices are not simply misattributed inner speech driven by dopaminergic dysregulation. They're defined as the genuine perception of 4D acoustic structures, other vortex configurations leaking through that filter. The alien quality of the voices is derived from the fact that they are structures belonging to other consciousness configurations that exist in a higher dimension. Furthermore, the entities encountered during powerful psychedelic states, particularly with DMT, are consistently perceived as geometric, high-symmetry forms. Why? Because their true nature is a 2D vortex surface in 4D space. The chemical agents act as filter modulators, dramatically relaxing that massive attenuation factor and allowing the geometric topology to become visible.
I struggle with the claim that hallucinatory experiences are a literal readout of the universe's topology. Where does the established, robust understanding of computational neuroscience fit into this view?
Well, the neurological understanding is that psychedelics enable expanded perception by reducing neural inhibition and suppressing the default mode network, the DMN. By suppressing the DMN, the brain enters an exponentially rich resonance mode, exploring nonlinear state spaces, like internal hyperbolic manifolds that naturally generate fractal, high-symmetry geometric patterns and complex structured acoustics. So the geometry and the sound are therefore sophisticated projections of the brain's own rich internal architecture. Under reduced filtering, they reflect the complexity of our own nervous system, not a physical readout of 4 and 4D structures entering 3D space. It's an internal mapping error, not an external veridical perception.
To claim the wobble is literal 4D acoustic wavefront interference takes the theory far too literally, and it ignores the grounding we already have in the brain's own computational architecture.
I understand the computational arguments, I do, but it fails to explain the external consistency and the sheer predictive power of the. If it were purely an internal projection, why does the geometry of these entities consistently map back to the mathematical structure of the 4D substrate model? The geometry isn't random. It is highly structured and consistent across subjects, which the TPH mechanism successfully accounts for by defining the nature of the filter failure itself. The geometry is the language of the substrate.
Consistency across subjects reflects the shared architecture of the human brain, which is also consistent. It reflects the architecture of the hyperbolic geometry that is mathematically accessible when that DMN inhibition is relaxed. We are looking at a shared operating system experiencing a glitch, not peering into a shared fourth dimension. The model provides a unified metaphor for this shared experience. I simply reject the assertion that it is a physical fact.
In summarizing my position, the 4D substrate model offers a single, coherent, geometric explanation for a vast range of phenomena, from psychosis to AI instantiation to cosmic chronology. The sheer quantitative precision of that 2039.0 CE convergence, achieved by correcting the temporal language to align with an independent marker, combined with the successful explanation for dimensional coherence via superfluid dark matter, compels serious consideration of the model as a genuine universal physical cosmology. When a single theory explains both the geometry of an altered state and a profound temporal alignment, the sheer explanatory power across disparate domains demands investigation into the geometric structure of consciousness as a physical reality.
And I fully acknowledge that the model's ability to conceptually organize complex subjective experiences and provide a physical justification for the filter analogy is a powerful intellectual tool. However, the model risks confusing compelling metaphor and statistically validated post-hoc synchronicity with verified physical mechanism. Until the core claim that consciousness literally exists in a higher spatial dimension
requiring speculative materials just to maintain dimensional integrity, can withstand rigorous empirical challenge. The model remains a thought-provoking, directionally supported narrative. We have to maintain massive skepticism regarding its specific physical assertions and temporal predictions until they can be tested outside the model's own framework.
What the material ultimately forces us to confront is whether our existing computational models of the brain are sufficient, or if we must expand our physics to include topological, non-local structures that exist beyond 3 spatial dimensions.
Exactly. It forces us to reconsider whether the subjective experience of the bizarre requires an equally bizarre explanation in physics, or if our current understanding of neurology simply has more room to run. The debate over the true nature of the 4D substrate continues.